The billionaire returned home, pretending to be poor, to test his family. What they did shocked him. Marcus Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office in Palo Alto, California, watching the fog roll over the Santa Cruz Mountains. At 28 years old, he had conquered a world that most people could only dream of entering. As the founder and CEO of Vanguard Holdings, a formidable tech and real estate acquisition empire, Marcus possessed a personal net worth hovering around $850 million. He had a fleet of luxury cars he rarely drove, a sprawling estate in Woodside he barely slept in, and a private jet that could take him anywhere on the globe at a moment's notice. Yet, as he looked out at the sprawling, wealthy valley below him, an undeniable and profound emptiness gnawed at his chest. Money could buy compliance, it could buy comfort, and it could certainly buy power, but it could not rewrite history. The silence of his expansive, minimalist office was broken by the soft chime of the oak double doors opening. His executive assistant, Sarah, walked in, her heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. She held a silver tray, upon which rested a single, thick, cream-colored envelope. It stood out starkly against the sleek, modern aesthetic of Vanguard Holdings. "This just arrived via priority courier, Mr. Vance," Sarah said, her tone professional but laced with a hint of curiosity. "It's personal. From Atlanta." Marcus didn't turn away from the window immediately. The mere mention of Atlanta made the muscles in his jaw tighten. 10 years had passed, but the oppressive, humid air of Georgia and the suffocating expectations of the Vance family name still haunted him. He finally turned, his dark eyes locking onto the envelope. He walked over to his massive glass desk and picked it up. The paper was heavy, expensive, and sealed with gold wax, bearing a crest he knew all too well. "Thank you, Sarah." "Hold my calls for the next hour," Marcus instructed quietly. As the door clicked shut behind her, Marcus broke the seal. He slid out the thick cardstock and read the elegant, flowing calligraphy. It was an invitation to the grand estate in Buckhead, Atlanta. Arthur Vance, his father, was throwing an extravagant gala to celebrate his 70th birthday. The wording was pretentious, boasting of a black tie affair meant to gather the absolute elite of Southern high society. At the very bottom, scrawled in a hasty, almost dismissive handwriting that Marcus recognized immediately as his stepmother Eleanor's, was a brief note. "Marcus, your father insists you attend. Do try to make yourself presentable if you can afford the trip." Marcus let out a hollow, bitter laugh, tossing the invitation onto his desk. They had no idea. 10 years ago, in that very same Buckhead mansion, Arthur Vance had stood in the grand foyer and delivered an ultimatum. Marcus had just turned 18 and refused to drop his computer engineering pursuits to become a junior associate at Vance Traditional Real Estate, the family's supposedly unshakable enterprise. The argument had been explosive. Arthur, his face purple with rage, had called Marcus a fool, a dreamer, and ultimately a failure. "If you walk out those doors to play with your little machines, you leave with nothing. You will never amount to anything in this world without my name, boy. Never!" Arthur had roared, his voice echoing off the marble floors. Eleanor had stood by with a smirk of satisfaction, while his older brother David, the so-called golden child, hadn't even bothered to look up from his phone. Marcus had walked out into the pouring rain with a single duffel bag and $50 in his pocket. He had never looked back. He starved, he struggled, he coded through the night in freezing dorm rooms, and he built Vanguard Holdings from a desperate idea into a ruthless corporate leviathan. He had won. But as he stared at the gold-embossed invitation, a dark, lingering question surfaced in his mind. What if he went back? What if he returned, not as the Silicon Valley titan, not as the billionaire who could buy the entire Vance family legacy with a single phone call, but as the failure they all expected him to be? Would his father show a shred of paternal grace? Would his family see past the lack of wealth and simply be glad that the lost son had returned home? Or would they prove to be exactly the shallow, status-obsessed monsters he remembered? Marcus walked over to his private executive bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror. He was sharply dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than most people made in 6 months. His short curly hair was perfectly trimmed. He radiated authority and wealth. This would not do. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Sarah, cancel my meetings for the rest of the week. I need you to arrange a commercial flight to Atlanta. Economy class. No VIP escorts, no private cars waiting at the tarmac. And I need you to find me a thrift store on the way to the airport." 3 hours later, Marcus stood in a dingy, dimly lit second-hand shop on the outskirts of San Jose. He meticulously moved through the racks, ignoring the strange looks from his security detail waiting in the black SUV outside. He selected a worn, faded khaki work shirt with frayed edges around the collar. He found a pair of stiff, dirty blue jeans that looked like they had seen years of hard manual labor. He purchased a pair of scuffed, heavy brown work boots, the leather cracked and stained with old oil. Finally, he found a faded green military-style backpack, the canvas rough and weathered. When he changed into the clothes in the back of the SUV on the way to the airport, the transformation was jarring. The billionaire was gone. In his place sat a young man who looked like he had spent the last decade working grueling, thankless shifts just to scrape by. He looked tired. He looked poor. The commercial flight to Atlanta was uncomfortable, cramped, and exactly what he needed to ground himself in his new reality. By the time he landed at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, the stifling heat and heavy humidity of Georgia wrapped around him like a wet blanket. He didn't hail an executive car. He took the public train, transferring to a local bus that dropped him a mile away from the exclusive gated community in Buckhead. As Marcus walked the final mile along the manicured, tree-lined avenues of his childhood, the weight of his $850 million seemed to vanish entirely. He was no longer the CEO. He was the prodigal son, returning in rags. He rolled up the sleeves of the worn khaki shirt, the rough fabric scratching against his skin. He slung the green military-style backpack over one shoulder, adjusting the strap. His heart pounded with a mixture of deep sorrow, anxiety, and a cold, calculating resolve. He was about to test the blood in his family's veins, and he was fully prepared for it to run ice-cold. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Marcus finally reached the colossal wrought-iron gates of the Vance estate. The sheer scale of the property was just as intimidating as he remembered. Beyond the gates stretched a long, winding driveway made of pristine, crushed white gravel, flanked by perfectly manicured emerald lawns and ancient oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. At the end of the long approach stood the family mansion, a breathtaking, luxurious, modern structure with soaring white columns, immense windows, and imposing, heavy black double doors. Marcus pressed the intercom button at the pedestrian gate. He gave his name, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. There was a long pause of static before the gate clicked and swung open with a heavy groan. He began the long walk up the driveway. The gravel crunched loudly beneath his scuffed brown work boots. Every step felt heavier than the last. The green military backpack dragged at his shoulder, acting as the perfect physical manifestation of the emotional burden he was carrying. He kept his head slightly down, allowing his shoulders to slump, adopting the posture of a man who had been thoroughly defeated by the world. He allowed the genuine exhaustion of the journey to show on his face, manifesting as a deep, shameful embarrassment. As he neared the grand entrance, he noticed movement. The heavy black double doors swung open before he even reached the marble steps. They were waiting for him. Standing directly to his right, bathed in the warm, bright sunlight, was his father, Arthur Vance. Arthur had aged, his hair now a short, distinguished gray, matching a neatly trimmed gray beard. But his eyes were exactly the same, sharp, calculating, and unforgiving. He was dressed impeccably in a sharp, custom-tailored navy blue blazer, a crisp, light blue dress shirt, and a rich brown leather belt. Next to Arthur stood Eleanor, Marcus's stepmother. She was a woman who practically radiated elitism, aged somewhere in her early 50s. She wore a flawless, professional beige tailored skirt suit with a sleek black top underneath. Heavy gold earrings and a matching gold bracelet caught the sunlight, flashing brilliantly. Behind them, slightly out of focus in the shadows of the grand doorway, stood his older brother David and his wife Chloe. They were dressed in designer casual wear, looking like they had just stepped out of a luxury magazine catalog. Marcus stopped at the base of the marble steps. He looked up, his expression sad, his posture displaying utter defeat. He waited for a word of greeting. He waited for his father to step forward, to ask him where he had been, to ask if he was okay. He waited for just a single drop of human decency. Instead, a loud, booming sound shattered the quiet afternoon air. It was laughter. Arthur Vance threw his head back and burst into an enthusiastic, booming laugh. It wasn't a chuckle, it was a deep, guttural roar of absolute amusement and vicious triumph. Arthur's face split into a wide, open-mouthed smile. He raised his right hand, pointing his index finger directly forward at Marcus in a dramatic, accusatory, and mocking gesture. The sheer force of his movement caused a slight blur as his arm extended. "Look!" Arthur roared between bouts of cruel laughter. "Look at what the cat dragged in! 10 years! 10 years, and I told you! Didn't I tell you all?" Eleanor joined in instantly. She let out a high-pitched, hearty laugh, a big, open-mouthed smile stretching across her heavily made-up face. She mirrored her husband perfectly, raising her own right hand, pointing her manicured finger directly at Marcus's worn khaki shirt and dirty blue jeans. "Oh, Arthur, you were entirely right," Eleanor gasped, laughing so hard she had to place her left hand on her chest. "Look at the absolute state of him. He looks like a vagrant. Are those boots from a garbage bin? Heavens! I can smell the poverty from the porch." In the background, David and Chloe stepped closer to the sunlight, pulling each other close as they descended into loud, mocking hysterics. David was holding his stomach, pointing at Marcus's faded green backpack, completely consumed by the sheer entertainment of his younger brother's apparent misery. Chloe was cackling, leaning against David's shoulder, pointing her finger in the same direction, her face twisted in a mocking sneer. The sound of their collective, open-mouthed laughter echoed off the massive white columns. It was a symphony of arrogance and cruelty. The natural, warm, sunny atmosphere of the estate provided a sickening, cinematic contrast to the cold, emotional slaughter taking place on the driveway. Marcus stood frozen. He kept his head slightly down, his curly hair catching the wind. The embarrassment and shame he projected outward were acting, part of the disguise, but the pain slicing through his chest in that exact moment was very, very real. They were enjoying this. They were absolutely thrilled that he had seemingly failed. His father wasn't looking at a son. He was looking at a living, breathing validation of his own ego. The old man was pointing at him not as a family member, but as a victory trophy. "I told you the world would eat you alive, boy," Arthur shouted, his laughter finally subsiding into a wide, malicious grin as he lowered his pointing finger. He walked down a single marble step, looking down his nose at Marcus. "You rejected my legacy. You thought you were smarter than all of us. And now look at you, crawling back home in rags, wearing dirt and failure like a cheap suit." Marcus tightened his grip on the strap of his green backpack. He forced his voice to sound weak, trembling just slightly. "Hello, Father. It's been a long time. I don't have anywhere else to go." Eleanor scoffed loudly, wiping a tear of mirth from her eye. "Oh, don't think you are walking into my pristine house with those filthy boots, Marcus. Martha just polished the Italian marble floors in the foyer. You'll track disease in here." David finally spoke up from the background, his voice laced with venomous amusement. "Hey, little brother, want me to toss you a couple of quarters? Maybe you can go buy a sandwich down at the gas station. You look like you haven't eaten a decent meal since you left us." The laughter erupted again, cruel and relentless. Marcus remained silent, enduring the barrage of insults. He let them laugh. He let them point their fingers and make their jokes. He memorized every single sneer, every open-mouthed cackle, every condescending word. He had come thousands of miles to find out if the Vance family had a heart, and they had just handed him his answer on a silver platter. Beneath the worn khaki shirt, underneath the disguise of a defeated, broken young man, the billionaire CEO of Vanguard Holdings made his final decision. The sadness in his eyes hardened into something entirely different, something cold, sharp, and highly dangerous. The trap was set. They had gleefully stepped right into it, and Marcus Vance was going to make sure the jaws snapped shut with devastating precision. The laughter finally subsided, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence in its wake. Arthur Vance wiped a tear of cruel mirth from his eye and straightened his perfectly tailored navy blue blazer. He looked down at Marcus, who remained standing at the bottom of the marble steps, his head bowed, his hands gripping the frayed straps of his green military backpack. "Well," Arthur said, his voice dropping its booming amusement and adopting a tone of cold, hard authority. "Since you have chosen to show up unannounced and looking like a stray dog, I suppose I cannot let you starve on the streets of Atlanta. It would reflect poorly on the family name if the press caught wind of a Vance begging for loose change. But make no mistake, Marcus, you are not a guest in this house. You forfeited that right a decade ago." Eleanor crossed her arms, her gold bracelets clinking together sharply. "Arthur, you cannot be serious. We have the gala this weekend. The governor is attending. The city council will be here. We cannot have this vagrant wandering the halls and ruining the aesthetic of the evening." "He won't be in the halls, Eleanor," Arthur replied sharply, never taking his eyes off his youngest son. "Marcus, you are forbidden from using the front doors. You will not set foot in the foyer, the living rooms, or any of the upper floors. You will walk around to the tradesman entrance at the back of the estate. You will sleep in the unfinished section of the basement, past the wine cellar. There is an old storage room there. And tomorrow, since you are clearly accustomed to manual labor now, you will earn your keep by helping the landscaping crew prepare the grounds for my birthday gala. Do I make myself clear?" Marcus slowly raised his head. He looked into his father's eyes, searching for even a flicker of hesitation or regret. There was none, only a wall of utter contempt. "Yes, father," Marcus said softly, his voice deliberately hoarse. "I understand." David chuckled from the shadows of the doorway, wrapping an arm around Chloe's waist. "Better get to it, little brother. It's a long walk around the east wing. Try not to track dirt on the cobblestones." Without another word, Marcus turned away from the grand entrance. He adjusted the heavy green backpack on his shoulder and began the humiliating trek around the perimeter of the massive estate. He walked past the sparkling infinity pool, past the immaculately trimmed rose gardens, and finally reached the heavy steel door of the service entrance. He pushed it open and descended a flight of steep, concrete stairs into the belly of the mansion. The contrast between the sunlit, opulent exterior and the dark, damp basement was staggering. The air down here smelled of dust, old cardboard, and faint mildew. Marcus navigated through narrow corridors, past rows of locked, climate-controlled doors guarding thousands of bottles of vintage wine, until he found the unfinished storage room his father had mentioned. It was a bleak, windowless concrete box. A single flickering fluorescent bulb hung from the exposed ceiling joists. In the corner sat a discarded, lumpy mattress covered in a thin layer of dust, surrounded by broken furniture and old moving boxes. This was where Arthur Vance believed his son deserved to live. Marcus dropped his backpack onto the concrete floor. The heavy thud echoed off the bare walls. He sat down on the edge of the filthy mattress, the rusted springs groaning in protest. He leaned his elbows on his knees, burying his face in his hands. He wasn't crying, but the sheer emotional exhaustion of the charade was taking its toll. He had a private jet waiting on a tarmac just an hour away. He had a penthouse in San Francisco with silk sheets and panoramic views of the bay. Yet here he was, sitting in the dark, breathing in the scent of decay. Suddenly, he heard the soft, hesitant scuffing of orthopedic shoes against the concrete floor outside the door. Marcus looked up just as a figure stepped into the dim light of the storage room. It was Martha. She was the family's head housekeeper, a kind-hearted woman in her early 60s with a warm, weathered face and gentle, tired eyes. She wore a simple black uniform with a pristine white apron. When she saw Marcus sitting on the ruined mattress in his dirty khaki shirt and worn jeans, she gasped. "Oh, my sweet boy," Martha whispered, her voice trembling as tears instantly welled up in her eyes. "Marcus? Is it really you?" Marcus stood up, a genuine soft smile finally breaking through the facade. "Hello, Martha." She hurried across the room and threw her arms around him, pulling him into a tight maternal embrace. Marcus hugged her back tightly. It was the first moment of genuine warmth he had felt since arriving in Georgia. Martha pulled back, her hands resting on his cheeks, wiping away a smudge of dirt near his jaw. "Look at you," she said, her voice breaking. "I heard what Mr. Vance did. I heard the laughing from the kitchen windows. It broke my heart, Marcus. It absolutely broke my heart. You don't deserve this. You never deserved how they treated you." "It's all right, Martha," Marcus said gently, keeping his voice low so the sound wouldn't carry up the vents. "I'm just tired, that's all." "You must be starving," she said, immediately shifting into her caretaker instincts. She reached outside the door and brought in a large covered silver tray. "I sneaked this down as soon as the kitchen staff went on break. It's hot roast beef, mashed potatoes, and fresh bread, and I brought you a clean, thick wool blanket and a pillow from the guest linens. Don't worry, I won't tell a soul." Marcus looked at the steaming food and the clean, folded blanket. A lump formed in his throat. In a house worth $30 million, occupied by a family obsessed with extreme wealth and high society status, the only person who possessed a single ounce of actual human decency was the woman they paid to scrub their floors. "Thank you, Martha," Marcus said quietly, his eyes shining with a profound, quiet gratitude. "You have no idea how much this means to me." "Eat, my boy," she insisted, patting his arm affectionately before turning to leave. "Get some rest. I will check on you tomorrow. Just stay out of Mr. Arthur's way." As Martha's footsteps faded down the hallway, Marcus sat back down on the mattress. He uncovered the tray and ate in silence. His mind was racing, cold and sharp. His father and brother had proven their cruelty, but Martha had just proven that there was still something in this house worth protecting. He finished his meal, wrapped himself in the warm blanket, and stared up at the concrete ceiling. He had the answers he needed. Now it was time to uncover their secrets. The following morning arrived with the suffocating, humid heat typical of a Georgia summer. Marcus was awakened at 6 in the morning by the harsh voice of the estate manager, who unceremoniously handed him a pair of heavy leather work gloves and a rusted pair of pruning shears. True to his word, Arthur had assigned his youngest son to the landscaping crew, forcing him to do the most grueling, physically demanding labor under the scorching southern sun. For hours, Marcus worked in silence. He wore his faded jeans and the heavy brown work boots, the thick fabric of his khaki shirt sticking to his back with sweat. He hauled bags of heavy premium mulch, dug trenches for new irrigation lines, and trimmed the massive, thorny rose bushes that lined the perimeter of the grand stone patio. His hands blistered beneath the gloves, his muscles aching from the unaccustomed strain. Yet he kept his head down, maintaining the illusion of a broken, desperate man willing to do anything for a roof over his head. By mid-afternoon, the sun was at its absolute peak. The rest of the landscaping crew had retreated to the shade of the ancient oak trees for their lunch break, leaving Marcus alone on his knees near the large open French doors that led directly into his father's private study. Marcus was dragging a heavy bag of fertilizer when he suddenly stopped. From inside the study, the sound of raised, panicked voices drifted out into the heavy afternoon air. He carefully set the bag down and crept closer to the stone wall, pressing his back against the cool masonry just out of sight of the open glass doors. It was his father, Arthur, and his older brother, David. And they were not laughing anymore. "What do you mean the bridge loan was denied, David?" Arthur's voice was a harsh, terrified hiss, completely devoid of the booming arrogance he had displayed on the driveway the day before. "I gave you one simple task. You told me the bank guaranteed the extension. They pulled out, Dad," David shot back, his voice cracking with panic. He sounded like a frightened child, not the confident heir to a real estate empire. "The auditors looked at our Q3 margins. They saw the massive defaults on the downtown commercial properties. Word is getting out. The lenders know we are over-leveraged by over $90 million. They won't give us another dime. Marcus closed his eyes, leaning against the stone, a slow, dark realization washing over him. The Vance family wasn't just struggling. They were drowning. 90 million, Arthur groaned, the sound accompanied by the heavy thud of a fist hitting a solid mahogany desk. If this leaks to the press before the gala, we are finished. The creditors will seize everything. The commercial properties, the corporate accounts. They will foreclose on this very house, David. We will be thrown onto the street. I know! David paced frantically, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. But we still have the buyout. That's our lifeline, Dad. Vanguard Holdings. Their acquisition team has already reviewed our assets. If we can just get them to sign the final paperwork, they will assume all our debts and buy us out for $120 million. We walk away clean. We keep the house, we keep our status, and nobody ever has to know we went bankrupt. Marcus's eyes snapped open. He stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. A cold, electric thrill shot down his spine. Vanguard Holdings. They were waiting for Vanguard Holdings to save them. They were begging for a bailout from a mysterious California investment firm, completely unaware that the very CEO and sole owner of that firm was currently sweating in dirty jeans outside their window, holding a pair of rusted pruning shears. The Vanguard representatives are flying in from Silicon Valley for the gala this Saturday, Arthur said, his voice trembling with desperate hope. They promised their CEO would be in attendance to finalize the acquisition personally. This man is a ghost, David. Nobody knows what he looks like, but he is known to be utterly ruthless. We have to project absolute strength and unlimited wealth at this party. We have to show him that Vance traditional real estate is a crown jewel, not a sinking ship. If he smells blood in the water, he will pull the deal, and we are dead. We will, Dad. I promise. Chloe and Eleanor have spared no expense on the catering and the decorations. When the CEO of Vanguard walks through those doors, he will see Southern royalty. We just have to survive until Saturday. Make sure your idiot brother stays out of sight, Arthur sneered, his tone turning vicious again. If the Vanguard executives see Marcus wandering around looking like homeless trash, they will think we associate with peasants. Keep him locked in the basement during the party. I won't let him ruin this for us. Marcus slowly pushed himself away from the stone wall. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his dirty glove. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face, transforming his exhausted features into a mask of pure, calculated dominance. The puzzle pieces had fallen into place perfectly. His family's entire existence, their fake superiority, their massive house, and their arrogant laughter. It was all a fragile house of cards built on a foundation of massive debt. And Marcus was holding the fan. He walked away from the French doors, retreating to the safety of the dense oak trees. He checked his surroundings, ensuring the landscaping crew was still distracted. Then, reaching deep into the pocket of his dirty blue jeans, Marcus pulled out a cheap, prepaid burner phone. He dialed a secure California number. It rang only twice before his executive assistant answered. Sarah, Marcus said, his voice low, sharp and commanding, completely stripping away the facade of the broken sun. Mr. Vance, Sarah replied crisply. Is everything proceeding as expected in Atlanta? Better than expected, Marcus replied, his eyes fixed on the towering white columns of the mansion. I need you to contact the legal acquisition team. Tell them to finalize the foreclosure documents and the buyout contracts for Vance Traditional Real Estate. I want everything printed, bound, and ready for signature. Understood, sir. Should the team proceed to the Vanguard Atlanta office? No, Marcus said, his smile deepening into something devastating. Tell the lead attorney to put on his best suit. He's coming to a birthday party this Saturday. And tell him to bring the absolute worst possible terms for the buyout. We aren't saving them, Sarah. We are liquidating them. Right away, Mr. Vance. Marcus hung up the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He looked down at his dirty hands, the blisters stinging beneath the leather gloves. He picked up his rusted pruning shears and walked back out into the blazing sun. He had 3 days left to play the part of the humiliated beggar. 3 days of sleeping in the damp concrete basement. 3 days of enduring their sneers and their cruelty. But when Saturday night arrived, the billionaire was coming out of the shadows, and he was going to burn their fake empire to the ground. Saturday evening descended upon the Buckhead estate like a velvet curtain, bringing with it a cool breeze that did nothing to extinguish the suffocating tension inside the mansion. The Vance property had been completely transformed into a spectacle of staggering artificial opulence. A fleet of valets in crisp white uniforms sprinted down the crushed gravel driveway, parking a seemingly endless parade of Ferraris, Bentleys, and Mercedes Maybachs. A classical string quartet, positioned on the grand stone patio beneath the ancient oak trees, played a flawless rendition of Vivaldi. Waitstaff carried silver platters loaded with caviar blinis, truffles, and towering flutes of imported champagne. The aesthetic of the evening was absolute perfection. It was an illusion of unshakable wealth, a desperate, sparkling lie designed to blind the city's elite to the $90 million of crushing debt hiding just beneath the floorboards. Marcus was forced into the absolute center of this masquerade, yet ordered to remain entirely invisible. The estate manager had thrown a cheap, ill-fitting white catering shirt and stiff black slacks at him earlier that afternoon. The shirt was tight across his broad shoulders, the fabric scratching against his skin, and the black trousers were slightly too short, drawing attention to his scuffed, heavy brown work boots, which he had been forbidden to change. He was assigned the lowest task possible, a shadow busboy. His only job was to silently weave through the glittering crowd, collect empty crystal glasses, wipe up spilled liquor, and disappear before anyone of importance could notice him. From the shadows of the grand foyer, holding a silver tray laden with discarded champagne flutes, Marcus watched his family perform. Arthur Vance was in his element, holding court near the towering ice sculpture in the center of the ballroom. He wore a bespoke, midnight blue tuxedo that radiated authority. He threw his head back and laughed heartily at a joke made by the mayor of Atlanta, clapping the politician on the shoulder with the easy confidence of a man who owned the world. Eleanor drifted gracefully beside him in a staggering floor-length emerald silk gown. Diamonds dripped from her neck and wrists, catching the light of the massive crystal chandeliers overhead. She smiled warmly at the wives of real estate tycoons, her eyes scanning the room with sharp, predatory calculation. It was a masterclass in deception. Marcus almost had to admire their sheer audacity. They were 96 hours away from total financial ruin, yet they stood there drinking thousands of dollars worth of champagne they hadn't paid for. Across the room, standing near the expansive French doors, was David. He was surrounded by a circle of young, wealthy investors and local developers. Chloe was plastered to his side in a tight, shimmering silver dress, looking at her husband with manufactured adoration. Marcus edged closer, sliding behind a massive marble pillar to clear a side table, keeping his head down as he listened to his brother's booming voice. "The market is shifting, gentlemen, but Vance traditional real estate is always 10 steps ahead," David boasted, swirling the amber liquid in his rocks glass. "In fact, we are about to finalize a massive strategic partnership. I'm sure you've heard the rumors." "Vanguard Holdings, right?" asked a young man in a sharp gray suit, his tone laced with awe. "The California firm. Nobody even knows who the CEO is. The guy is a total ghost. How did you manage to reel them in, David?" David let out a condescending chuckle, adjusting his silk bow tie. "Oh, you know how it is. High-level networking. The Vanguard CEO and I have been circling each other for months. Brilliant guy, ruthless, but he recognizes a crown jewel when he sees one. He practically begged us for the acquisition. We're expanding our portfolio to the West Coast, merging our assets. It's a multi-hundred-million-dollar play." Marcus almost dropped his silver tray. The sheer, unadulterated fiction of it all was staggering. David was painting himself as a titan of industry, negotiating with a peer, completely unaware that the brilliant, ruthless CEO he was pretending to know was currently standing 10 feet away, wearing a cheap catering shirt and clearing his empty appetizer plates. Suddenly, a sharp, manicured hand grabbed Marcus's bicep with vicious force. dragging him violently behind the heavy velvet drapes near the hallway. It was Eleanor. Her emerald gown rustled angrily, and her face, previously a mask of perfect southern charm, was twisted in furious disgust. "What are you doing standing out in the open, you clumsy fool?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "I told the manager to keep you in the back corridors. Do you want the governor to see Arthur's disgraced failure of a son playing butler? You look like absolute trash. Get out of my sight before you ruin this entire evening." Marcus looked down at her. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. The posture of the defeated son vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by a stare so cold and piercing that Eleanor actually took a half-step backward, her breath catching in her throat. "I apologize, Eleanor," Marcus said softly, his tone completely devoid of the fear she expected. "I was just making sure the guests were fully accommodated." "Get back to the kitchen," she spat, recovering her composure and pointing a trembling, diamond-clad finger down the hall. "And do not come out until the party is over." Marcus offered a slow, deliberate nod. He turned and walked down the dimly lit servants' corridor. But he didn't go to the kitchen. He ducked into a small, empty butler's pantry, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. The muffled sounds of the string quartet and the roaring laughter of the party faded into a low hum. He set the tray of dirty glasses down on the counter. Reaching into the pocket of his stiff black slacks, he pulled out his prepaid burner phone. The screen illuminated the dark, cramped room. He opened his encrypted messaging app. There was a single text from his executive assistant, Sarah, sent 3 minutes ago. "The Vanguard legal team has arrived at the front gates. All documents are finalized. Awaiting your signal, Mr. Vance." Marcus stared at the glowing screen. The memories of the last decade flashed through his mind. The cold nights in Palo Alto, the relentless grind, the empire he built from nothing. And then, the memories of the last 3 days. The driveway humiliation, the vicious laughter, the damp concrete of the basement, and Martha's secret acts of kindness. He typed a single word and hit send. Execute. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, unbuttoned the top button of his cheap, scratchy white shirt, and rolled up his sleeves. The time for hiding in the shadows was over. The trap was about to spring. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom had reached a fever pitch of celebration. Arthur Vance was practically glowing with triumphant energy. He had successfully navigated the room, shaking the right hands, projecting the perfect image of impenetrable wealth, and securing his social standing among Atlanta's absolute elite. The anxiety that had plagued him for months was temporarily masked by the expensive champagne and the collective admiration of his peers. Suddenly, the heavy black double doors of the grand foyer swung open with a definitive, echoing thud. The immediate silence that rippled through the front of the house quickly spread to the back of the ballroom. The string quartet, sensing the shift in the room's energy, allowed their music to fade into a hesitant stop. Hundreds of wealthy guests turned their attention toward the entrance. Stepping over the threshold was a group of 3 men who looked fundamentally different from everyone else in the room. They weren't wearing the colorful, flamboyant formal wear of Southern high society. They wore razor-sharp, custom-tailored, monochromatic black suits that practically radiated corporate hostility. Leading the trio was Richard Sterling, the legendary lead acquisitions attorney for Vanguard Holdings. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with slicked-back silver hair and eyes like chipped flint. He carried a heavy, brushed steel briefcase. He did not smile. He did not look at the ice sculptures or the diamond necklaces. He surveyed the room with the clinical detachment of a mortician arriving at a crime scene. Arthur Vance's heart leapt into his throat. He recognized the Vanguard lapel pins instantly. The moment of salvation had arrived. Arthur quickly set his champagne glass down on a passing tray and smoothed the lapels of his midnight blue tuxedo. He signaled for David, who abandoned his circle of investors and practically sprinted to his father's side. Together, projecting the utmost confidence, they marched through the parting crowd to greet the men who held their entire future in a steel briefcase. "Gentlemen!" Arthur boomed, his voice carrying easily across the silent, watching ballroom. He extended a hand, displaying his most charismatic, winning smile. "Welcome to my home. I am Arthur Vance. We are incredibly honored to have the representatives of Vanguard Holdings join my 70th birthday celebration." Richard Sterling looked at Arthur's extended hand for a fraction of a second too long before finally shaking it with a brief, firm grip. "Mr. Vance," Sterling said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried no warmth whatsoever. "I am Richard Sterling, lead counsel for Vanguard Holdings. We are here to conclude the business regarding Vance Traditional Real Estate." Of course, Arthur beamed, turning to the crowd. This was his moment. This was the theatrical climax he had planned to solidify his legacy. He raised his hands, gesturing for the attention of the governor, the mayor, and every wealthy competitor in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, friends, esteemed colleagues," Arthur announced loudly, "tonight is not just a celebration of my birthday. It is a celebration of the future. I am proud to officially announce that Vance Traditional Real Estate is entering into a monumental, multi-million-dollar acquisition and partnership with the West Coast titan Vanguard Holdings." A murmur of genuine awe and polite applause rippled through the crowd. Eleanor stepped forward, linking her arm through Arthur's, her chest swelling with pride. David puffed out his chest, looking back at the young investors he had been boasting to moments ago with a smug, victorious grin. They had done it. They had survived. Arthur turned back to Sterling, lowering his voice just slightly. "Mr. Sterling, if you would follow me to my private study, we can sign the documents, finalize the bailout, the acquisition, and you can join us for a drink." Sterling did not move. He planted his feet firmly on the Italian marble floor, his expression utterly unreadable. "That will not be necessary, Mr. Vance," Sterling said loudly, his voice slicing through the lingering applause and forcing the room back into dead silence. "There is no partnership. There is no merger. Vanguard Holdings is executing a hostile assumption of your $92 million in defaulted commercial debt. We are taking total ownership of your corporate assets, your bank accounts, and the deeds to all your private properties, including this estate." The silence in the ballroom became suffocating, the color instantly drained from Arthur's face. Eleanor's proud smile shattered, her grip on Arthur's arm turning into a panicked claw. David took a step back, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. What are you saying?" Arthur stammered, the booming confidence entirely stripped from his voice. "We had an agreement. The email stated we were finalizing the terms of the buyout tonight. You said your CEO was flying in to sign the papers and save the company. I said our CEO was attending to finalize the acquisition, Mr. Vance," Sterling corrected coldly, popping the dual locks on his steel briefcase. The loud clicks echoed like gunshots in the quiet room. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in black leather. "We are not saving your company. We are liquidating it." Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally broke through the aristocratic masks of the Vance family. Whispers erupted among the elite guests. The mayor stepped back. The wealthy competitors began to sneer. The illusion had been violently shattered. The $90 million secret was out in the open. "This is an outrage!" David suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He pointed a trembling finger at Sterling. "You can't do this! I spoke to your people! Where is he? Where is the CEO of Vanguard? I demand to speak to him right now! I want him standing in front of me!" Richard Sterling slowly closed his briefcase. He looked at David, then at Arthur, and finally let a tiny, razor-sharp smile touch the corners of his mouth. "You do not make demands of Vanguard Holdings," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, commanding timbre. He stepped aside, leaving a clear path behind him, and looked past the wealthy family, past the ice sculptures, directly toward the dark corridor leading to the servants' quarters. "But to answer your question," Sterling announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive, breathless ballroom, "the sole owner and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings is indeed present, and he is ready to take what belongs to him." The entire ballroom shifted. Hundreds of heads turned, frantically looking around the opulent space. Arthur, Eleanor, David, and Chloe whipped their heads around, their eyes wide with terror and confusion, searching the crowd for a mysterious billionaire in a $10,000 suit. They scanned the faces of politicians, oil barons, and tech moguls, but nobody stepped forward. The center of the room remained empty. And then, from the absolute back of the ballroom, emerging from the shadows of the dimly lit servants' hallway, came the slow, heavy, deliberate crunch of scuffed brown work boots against the polished hardwood floor. The rhythmic, heavy thud of the scuffed brown work boots echoed like a countdown clock through the dead silence of the grand ballroom. The crowd of Atlanta's most elite politicians, real estate tycoons, and socialites parted like the Red Sea. They instinctively pulled their silk gowns and bespoke tuxedos away from the approaching figure, murmuring in confusion and distaste. Stepping directly into the harsh, brilliant light of the massive crystal chandeliers was Marcus Vance. He was no longer hiding in the shadows of the servants' corridors. He had unbuttoned the top of the cheap, ill-fitting white catering shirt, revealing the collar of the worn khaki work shirt underneath. His dirty, faded blue jeans stood in stark, jarring contrast to the sea of luxury surrounding him. He did not walk with the slumped shoulders or the bowed head of the defeated son who had dragged himself up the crushed gravel driveway 3 days prior. He walked with the terrifying, predatory grace of a man who owned the very ground beneath his feet. His dark eyes were locked entirely on Richard Sterling. At the center of the room, Arthur Vance's face contorted from pale, panicked shock into a mask of absolute explosive rage. The sight of his youngest son, dressed like a vagrant and publicly interrupting the most critical, humiliating moment of his life, was too much to bear. "What in God's name are you doing?" Arthur roared, his voice cracking with fury and desperation. The sophisticated facade he had spent decades building finally shattered into a million pieces. He pointed a trembling finger at Marcus. "I gave you strict orders to stay in the basement. Security! Where is the estate security? Get this filthy, useless trash out of my house immediately!" Eleanor grabbed the sides of her face, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking wildly as she practically hyperventilated. "Arthur, do something! He is ruining everything! The governor is watching! Get him out!" David, desperate to salvage any remaining shred of his fabricated authority, lunged forward. He abandoned his spot next to the Vanguard legal team and marched directly toward Marcus, his face flushed red with anger. "You stupid, pathetic loser!" David hissed through clenched teeth, raising his hand to violently grab Marcus by the collar of his cheap catering shirt. "You picked the absolute worst time to embarrass us. I am going to throw you out onto the street myself." Marcus didn't flinch. As David's hand closed around the cheap white fabric, Marcus simply stopped walking. He slowly turned his head and looked at his older brother. The look in Marcus's eyes was so intensely cold, so entirely devoid of fear or submission, that David froze. The older brother felt a sudden, inexplicable chill run down his spine. The man standing before him was not the broken teenager they had kicked out a decade ago, nor the humiliated beggar from the driveway. There was a dangerous, immense power radiating from Marcus that David could not comprehend. "Take your hand off me, David," Marcus said softly. His voice did not echo, it did not shout, but it carried a razor-sharp authority that cut right through the murmurs of the crowd. "Before I take it from you." David's breath hitched. Involuntarily, his fingers uncurled. He took a slow, trembling step backward, his mind failing to process the dominant, terrifying aura his younger brother was projecting. Marcus adjusted his collar, completely ignoring his stunned brother, and continued his walk toward the center of the ballroom. He bypassed the towering ice sculpture. He bypassed his hyperventilating stepmother. He stopped directly in front of his father and the Vanguard legal team. Arthur's chest heaved as he prepared to scream for security once more. "You disgraceful—" "Mr. Vance," Richard Sterling's booming, authoritative baritone suddenly interrupted, cutting Arthur off completely. But Sterling was not looking at Arthur. The legendary lead counsel for Vanguard Holdings, a man who had just dismantled the entire Vance family legacy with a few cold words, turned his body entirely toward Marcus. Sterling straightened his posture, his expression shifting from clinical detachment to absolute, unwavering respect. "The final foreclosure documents and the hostile acquisition contracts have been fully audited and prepared, sir," Sterling stated clearly, his voice carrying to every single corner of the breathless ballroom. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy, solid gold Mont Blanc fountain pen. He held it out, presenting it to the young man in the dirty jeans. "We are simply awaiting your signature. Mr. CEO." The words dropped into the ballroom like a live grenade. Mr. CEO. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a suffocating, mind-bending vacuum of sound. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Arthur Vance's mouth fell open, a grotesque mirror of the laughing, mocking smile he had worn on the driveway 3 days ago. But this time, there was no laughter. His eyes bulged, darting frantically from the gold pen in Sterling's hand to the worn, scuffed boots on Marcus's feet, and finally up to his son's cold, unwavering face. The blood drained entirely from Arthur's head. His knees literally buckled, forcing him to grab the edge of a silver-plated catering table to keep from collapsing onto the marble floor. Eleanor let out a sharp, pathetic gasp, her hands dropping from her face as she stumbled backward, her emerald silk gown tangling around her legs. Behind them, Chloe let out a terrified sob, clutching her husband's arm. But David was unresponsive. The golden child, the heir to the Vance real estate empire, stood paralyzed. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The brilliant, ruthless West Coast ghost he had been bragging about to his investors all night. The man he had begged for a $90 million bailout. The man he had just threatened to throw into the street was his younger brother. The whispers among the elite crowd erupted into a deafening roar of shock. The governor stared in disbelief. The rival real estate developers exchanged looks of absolute astonishment. The pieces were slamming together in real time. The wealthiest family in Buckhead wasn't just broke. They had just been publicly conquered by the very son they had spent the last 10 years claiming was a miserable, worthless failure. Marcus slowly reached out and took the gold Mont Blanc pen from his lead attorney. He rolled the heavy metal between his fingers, feeling the familiar weight of his authority returning to his hands. He looked at his father. The old man was shaking, completely broken, staring at Marcus as if he were looking at a ghost. The charade was over. The billionaire had returned home. Marcus stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the Vanguard legal team. Sterling motioned to a junior associate, who instantly produced a sleek, black leather portfolio and opened it flat onto a nearby marble side table. The harsh, bright lights of the crystal chandeliers illuminated the thick stack of legal documents. At the very bottom of the final page, a single line awaited a signature. A signature that would legally transfer $92 million of debt, multiple commercial skyscrapers, and the very mansion they were standing inside to Vanguard Holdings. Without a moment of hesitation, without a single flicker of emotion, Marcus pressed the gold nib of the pen to the paper. He signed his name with a swift, fluid motion. It was done. Marcus handed the pen back to Sterling. He turned his back to the documents and finally faced his family. The elite guests of Atlanta watched in stunned, absolute silence, captivated by the devastating drama unfolding in the center of the ballroom. 3 days, Marcus began, his voice calm, steady, and echoing with the quiet power of an $850 million empire. 3 days ago, I walked up that crushed gravel driveway. I wore these boots. I wore a cheap backpack. I made sure to look like the exact failure you always predicted I would become. I wanted to see, after 10 years, if the Vance family had cultivated a single ounce of grace, empathy, or human decency. Marcus took a slow step toward his father. Arthur shrank back, his knuckles white as he gripped the catering table. "And what did you do?" Marcus asked, his tone turning to ice. "You stood by the double doors, you, Eleanor, David, and Chloe, and you laughed. You pointed your fingers at me in the bright sunlight, practically weeping with joy at the sight of my apparent poverty. You didn't invite me inside to ask if I was hungry. You didn't ask where I had been. You banished me to sleep on a rusted mattress in a damp concrete basement to protect your fake, pathetic social standing. Marcus, son, please, Arthur choked out, his voice a frail, pathetic rasp. Tears of sheer terror and humiliation welled in the old man's eyes. We didn't know. We didn't understand. You have to listen to me. We are blood. We are family. You can't do this to us. This is our home. Family? Marcus repeated, the word dripping with venomous disgust. Family died the night you threw an 18-year-old boy into the rain for refusing to be your puppet. You don't care about blood, Arthur. You only care about this. Marcus gestured broadly to the opulent ballroom, the ice sculptures, the crystal chandeliers. You care about the illusion. You care about the status. And the irony is, you couldn't even manage that. Marcus shifted his gaze to his older brother. David was visibly trembling, his eyes wide with fear. David ran your precious traditional empire straight into the ground, Marcus continued mercilessly, exposing their deepest, darkest secret to the entire room of their peers. Over-leveraged, defaulted commercial loans, $92 million in the red. You threw me in the basement to hide me from the very CEO you were begging to save you from bankruptcy. The gasps from the crowd were audible. The rival developers were already whispering, calculating the fallout. The Vance reputation was completely, permanently annihilated. Marcus, we can fix this, David pleaded, stepping forward, his voice cracking. We can work together. We can merge the companies. Just give us the bridge loan. Don't liquidate us. There is no merger, David, Marcus replied coldly. There is only an acquisition. And as of 60 seconds ago, I own everything. I own the commercial lots downtown. I own the corporate bank accounts. And I own the deed to this estate. Marcus looked at Eleanor, whose face was stained with ruined makeup and tears of panic. You were worried about me tracking dirt on your Italian marble floors, Eleanor. They are my floors now. Marcus turned back to Sterling. Mr. Sterling, what is the standard protocol for evicted tenants in a Vanguard residential foreclosure? Standard protocol dictates we provide the former occupants with 1 hour to vacate the premises, sir. Sterling replied precisely, his face devoid of sympathy. Whatever they can fit into their personal vehicles. The rest of the assets remain with the property. You heard my attorney, Marcus said, looking back at his father. You have exactly 60 minutes. Pack your bags. If you are not off my driveway by the time the clock strikes midnight, my security team will physically remove you. Arthur let out a devastating, heartbroken sob, burying his face in his hands. Eleanor wailed, sinking to her knees in her emerald gown. David and Chloe stood frozen in pure, unadulterated shock. They had lost everything. Their wealth, their home, their status, their pride. It was all gone, stripped away by the son they had mercilessly mocked. Marcus did not smile. There was no joy in this victory, only a necessary cold justice. He turned away from his weeping family and scanned the silent crowd, looking toward the dark corridors of the kitchen. Martha! Marcus called out, his voice suddenly losing its sharp edge, softening into something warm and genuine. From the shadows of the servants' entrance, the older, kind-faced housekeeper slowly stepped forward. She was trembling, her hands clutching her white apron, her eyes wide with disbelief at what she had just witnessed. Marcus walked over to her, completely ignoring the stares of the billionaires and politicians. He took her shaking hands in his own. Martha? Marcus said gently, a true smile finally breaking across his face. When I was sitting in the dark, pretending to have nothing, you were the only person in this $30 million house who treated me like a human being. You risked your job to bring me hot food and a warm blanket. You showed me the only real wealth that existed in this family. Marcus reached into his back pocket and pulled out a thick, sealed white envelope. He placed it gently into Martha's hands. Inside this envelope is a cashier's check for $2 million, heavily taxed and cleared, Marcus told her quietly, though the silence in the room allowed everyone to hear. And the deed to a 4-bedroom house in the nicest, quietest suburb in Atlanta, fully paid off. You are retiring tonight, Martha. You never have to scrub another floor or serve another arrogant family for the rest of your life. Martha gasped, tears instantly streaming down her weathered cheeks. She threw her arms around Marcus, hugging the billionaire in the dirty work shirt just as tightly as she had hugged the broken boy in the basement. "Thank you," she sobbed into his shoulder. "Oh, bless you, Marcus. Bless you." Marcus hugged her back, feeling the last remaining weight of his past finally lift from his shoulders. He pulled away, giving her a reassuring nod. He turned around one last time. He looked at his father, weeping on the floor. He looked at his brother, paralyzed by his own failure. He looked at the fake, glittering empire that he had just bought and shattered. They had wanted a test, and they had failed spectacularly. Without another word, Marcus Vance walked straight down the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted for him once more. He walked out of the grand foyer, pushed open the massive black double doors that he had been forbidden to use, and stepped out into the warm Georgia night. He left the crying, the shock, and the ruins of the Vance family behind him forever, finally entirely free.